So today we're going to talk about testing and assessment and good practices when it comes to designing test questions using Bloom's taxonomy to write your tests and design your projects and things for classes. We're also going to touch a bit on the perspective when it comes to grading. And I don't go over it in this particular lecture, but I do give you plenty of materials, and a lot of the materials, this sort of set of slides, are the core information that I'd like for you to pull from that. There's a lot of extra information and a lot of great information you should read. But one thing that we won't cover today is ungrading and specifications grading. So I'm going to give you guys some websites and tools to read more about that if that's something that you're interested in. But before we get into like designing a test or designing your questions, I first want to talk about exam reviews. So you're going to get students asking, oh, or have a test coming up, can you give some kind of session or review session on what we are supposed to study, right? So students often get caught up in what are you going to test on, what do I need to focus on? And so it's totally up to you if you want to give a review session. If you do, usually it's the class before the exam. And it can be the whole class, it can be a portion of the class. Totally up to you. But there are three sort of basic guidelines, rules that you want to think about when it comes to giving an exam review. So first of all, it should not be just a rehashing of the material, right? You should not just use a review session to just repeat stuff. You should be kind of focusing in, honing in on concepts that your students need to understand, and in kind of what capacity do they need to understand them. So I often tell like my intro to neuroscience students, when we go over the action potential, I expect you to be able to walk me through the steps and know this at the level that's not just recognizing it on a test, right? Not just being able to take a multiple choice test and be able to recognize what goes on in the action potential. I would expect for you to be able to write it out and explain it to me if I don't know anything about the action potential. So really, making sure your students understand what depth they need to know certain material. Never want to introduce new material. When you're doing a review session, always keep to the things that you have already gone over and that what you are going to test on. Just because you don't want students to then have to add to that, especially if you give an optional review session, because if they're not able to make it, then those students who make it are going to get an unfair disadvantage. And then finally, when we talk about active versus passive learning, so remember that active learning is typically better than passive learning. So if you can do an exam review that is engaging, so you could do like Jeopardy, for example, that's a kind of a fun way to do a review session. I've done this for exit exams for capstone courses where students break up in groups and then answer certain trivia questions that's based off of definitions that they've actually pulled together. And it's a nice sort of active, engaging way for them to go back over the material. So now let's talk about actually designing effective questions. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of the main ones. There are lots of these, and if you go into Blackboard especially or other learning management systems, you're going to see a lot of different types of questions that you can put on, for example, an online test. There's a lot of or quiz or some other kind of assessment. So there's a lot of variety, but we're going to stick to kind of the basics for this one, just to kind of give you some guidance on how you should frame these questions. So the first one is multiple choice questions. These, of course, a lot of instructors use this in a bigger class, like when you have 300 students, having a multiple choice question test is easier to grade. It's faster to grade. Of course, you can do a test that has a portion of multiple choice questions and then perhaps a few non-multiple choice answer questions that you would then have to go in and grade. So instead of grading, 5 essay questions, you could do 50 multiple choice in one essay. And that's, a different way to kind of go about trying to assess what they know. But multiple choice questions are really great for recognizing the answer, right? So it's this type of memory. It's bringing in, can the student read a question with a series of potential answers and be able to recognize the concept or the point? So some things that you have to consider: make sure you clearly identify the question, right? Make sure that the question has answer possibilities that are homogeneous. So think about like the length, the phrasing, the tenses that you use should be all very similar to each one. Be careful about using any precursor words that might give away the answer. So for example, using an example instead of a/an. So if you use and, then the student's going to know that the answer choice has to start with a vowel versus a consonant. So just kind of being mindful of grammar and not giving away certain answers due to the phrasing that you've used. Try to avoid any unnecessary or any irrelevant information in the question itself, because it weighs down the question and the student will then have a really hard time understanding what you're getting at. Like, what are you asking? So if they read a very compound question, then they might get lost in the question. So kind of being mindful of that. Try to use very straightforward, very clear language. Avoid negatives and double negatives, right? So sometimes students get kind of caught up in did you use a don't not use that sort of thing? Did you use a double negative? What are you asking? Especially if if you use them a lot, they can get very confusing if you use more negative type of questions. Try to avoid all of the above. And there's a couple of reasons why you want to avoid this. So one, students tend to answer this a particular way. Excuse me, they may want to just assume that all of the above is always the answer. And also, so try to kind of avoid doing that too many times. But also, if you're doing a test in a learning management system, if you're doing an online test and you scramble the answer choices, if all of the above is one of the answer choices, it might not be at the bottom. So another way that you could word this, if you were to want to use all of the above or none of the above, you could say all of these answers are correct, okay? Instead of giving it a location in space, okay? This would be a better way to have that answer choice. All of these answers are correct instead of, all the above. But again, you want to use those kind of sparingly. And any kind of universal statement like always or never, those are ones that also you have to think about as trying to avoid, because students can get caught up in those and start thinking of exceptions, and then they'll say, well, technically this doesn't always happen or something like that. So you just want to avoid some of those universal statements. True false questions are really great also for recognition. And you can do a kind of a mix of these two where you have a multiple choice kind of rooted in a true false. Another really fun way to do true false questions is true false with assertion. So basically what you have is a true false question. The student has to say, is it true or false and why? So they have to give some explanation or justification as to why. It's a really great way to take a recognition question and then turn it into a recall question, which is where they would have to recall and give you information that they have learned. You want to, again, avoid double negatives or just negatives in general, because that's hard. Okay, so if you're saying this is a negative and then that is false, does that make it true? It just gets really confusing. Try, again, not to use words that will give away the answer. So universal statements like always and never, they tend to be false. So just trying to make sure you word your question in a way that is not going to immediately give it away. Matching questions are really helpful for students to demonstrate that they understand definitions and terms. It's really helpful when you're doing dates and events, when you can match up description to principles and people to achievements. So those are really helpful ways to demonstrate that students understand that information. Ranking questions and sequencing questions are really good for steps and processes. So for example, if you're teaching a research methods class and you want students to tell you the method of scientific study, the scientific method, and then they can list out and rank those questions. If it's, for example, in the learning management system, they can actually assign a number to them or drag and drop them in order. I also like doing this for sequencing, like for example, like the example I used before of action potential. I could have all the steps of the action potential on there, and they would have to then put them in the order that they occur. So those are really nice. And then simulation questions, these are really fantastic for case studies and application. And sometimes these are the only ways that you can actually get at an application, is to ask them a scenario or a simulation and then have them basically describe how they would approach it, what they would do, or what they might find. I have a really funny case study series for my 101 class, my intro to psych class, where students actually read a scenario. It's basically a case study of different Star Wars characters, and then they have to then, using the resources that they're given, basically diagnose these Star Wars characters based off of the description of the symptoms and characteristics that I give them. So it's a really fun way to demonstrate application, and they can apply the knowledge that they have been getting and gaining along the way. These next two slides, so I want you to take a moment, and I do have this in Blackboard for you guys to look at. What this is a really nice way to think about Bloom's taxonomy, and then how you can either frame questions in a test or frame a project that you might do. So this is applying Bloom's taxonomy to how you assess students and what kinds of questions that you would ask. And so it goes all the way up to, of course, the creation level, using those keywords, and then how would you frame a question to get a student to think at that level, moving through all the different levels. So I do want you to take some time to walk through those and see these different kinds of questions that you can ask. And then also you can take these back to the learning objectives and learning outcomes that you have on your syllabus and make sure that they match up, because that's what you really want to do, is make sure that the kinds of questions that you're asking on a test, the way that you're assessing them, whether it's through exams and or projects or assessments, that you're asking these kinds of questions that are going to relate back to them demonstrating their knowledge through those specific learning outcomes. Another kind of just, general thing that I wanted to share with you guys is, how we think about grades versus assessments, right? So think in part of this is looking at the difference between grades and assessment, and then kind of looking at the difference between the two, but also part of this is how you frame the way that you talk about grades. Okay, so part of this is grades versus assessment, and then part of this is perspective, right? So when it comes to the verbiage that you use with students, a lot of people don't think about earning a grade. Okay, a lot of faculty say I gave a grade. Okay. I gave the student a grade, or I failed the student, or I passed the student. So remember that you have to think about the student and the fact that they are earning the grade. Think about how the perspective of taking points. So let's say you have 0 to 100 in terms of your points in your class. And obviously a 100 is an A plus and a 0 is an F, right? And then you have this scale everywhere in between. But if you, instead of thinking of, you start out the class with 100 points and you get those chipped away. Oh, I made, a lower grade on this test, so that brought me down to a 96. And then I forgot to turn this assignment in, and that was worth 5 points. Now I have a 91. And your grade going down, chipping away at it little by little. Instead, think about starting with a 0 and then moving your way up. So each assignment, oh, I got 5 points here out of 5. That's great. And now, we just did a test and that was worth 20 points. Now I have a grade of 25. And then moving all the way up until you get to 100. And then in that case, the student is earning their grade as they go instead of just being given a grade. And I really think that perspective helps a lot in terms of how we approach giving assessment and providing feedback for students in terms of the grade that they're earning. So the last couple things I want to talk about, one is this one is the types of assessments that you give that are not exams. Okay, so these are different kinds of ways to assess students. And the final thing I want to do is talk about rubrics, because it's going to tie in nicely to these types of assessments. So when we talk about classroom assessment, and we've talked about this a lot in class already, this is something that you can do in class. For example, an exit ticket is a really great way to kind of see, of today, how did you do in terms of the lecture? Did you understand the concepts? Or if you did an activity, did you understand the point of the activity? Could you apply whatever it might be? So you can really gauge how well the students are getting the material. And you can do this as a grade, so you can count this for a grade. Maybe you call this a participation grade. And students will use maybe a clicker, or you can use an app or software to have them go in and actually take like a 3-question quiz or answer one question or whatever it might be. So it might just be, hey, let's just gauge what you guys are doing today, and there's no grade tied to it. I just want to kind of get, are you getting this concept? Or it can be, or it could be an actual grade for them. Like they have to come to class, and that's a measure of their attendance and participation. Another thing that you can do in terms of assessment is an individual project. And you can also pair this with this group project down here to make it kind of like a jigsaw puzzle project where everybody does a piece of something that turns into something bigger. But typically, we see these individual projects as being really helpful because they allow the student to, earn their grade in a way that is all on them, right? So I'll do, for example, in sensation and perception, I have a different categories of topics that they can choose from for a project. It might be think about how people who have issues with seeing color, being able to drive and see signs, and how would you design a street, or how would you design a better way to accommodate people who have some form of color blindness or something like that. So, being able to kind of take something and apply it to what's going on in terms of the information that they're learning from the class is a really nice way to demonstrate higher up on that Bloom's taxonomy. Written product, this is one that most people, think of as like a paper, or, a paper doesn't have to be the final product. It could be something like an article review. So there was one class where they had, 10 total article reviews that they could do, but they had to do like 7 out of 10. They pick the articles from a list, and they have to, give it like what was good about the article, what was bad about the article, what did we learn from it, what did we learn from the experimental study, because they were all peer-reviewed research articles. And then, what is something that could be, done to improve this or further work? And so they have to, hit every element in their review, but they have to do it in like 500 words. And so giving students feedback is the number one thing, because as I was grading these article reviews, my point was, by the 7th one that they do, it should be a lot easier to grade because they have improved with the feedback that I've given them along the way. And that's exactly what I saw. The more practice you give them, and the more really high quality feedback you give them, the better writers they're going to be, and the better that they're going to continue doing. What I have found is that if you have one written assignment and you give them extensive feedback, but they don't have to improve that for whatever reason, like it's just a one draft thing, or they don't have to then submit a final version, your students will not read your feedback. Very few of them do. They're not going to be able to take it in, understand it, and then apply it to the next part unless they have to, right? So unless they have to improve the written product, they usually will not read that extensive feedback. So I have wasted time, in some cases, wasted hours on different papers trying to give students really solid feedback, only to find out that they don't actually even really read the feedback because that's their last kind of, that's their last draft. So, feedback is key when it comes to written product, so that students can then improve on that in your class. Oral product, this is also something, and I'm going to tie this into poster as well. So an oral product might be like you might have a student give a presentation, especially if it's like a public health focused class. It's really great to demonstrate how to communicate science to a target audience, for example. How they can manage that is, they might be good writers, but being able to actually do a presentation or something like that can help you understand if they know how to do that. Some students get, of course, they don't love the oral presentations. It makes them really nervous to speak in front of students. So you do have to consider that this might make some students uncomfortable. Another thing, and this is kind of related to oral product, because you can have students actually present. In my research methods class, I used to have students actually make a research poster. So it's a really, really wonderful tool. if you're using it for something like research methods or a research focused class, I had them actually design a poster, and I gave them lots of examples and a really strong rubric, which we'll talk about rubrics in a minute. And I had them present the poster. So it gave them an opportunity to give me a product and then also walk me through it. And they had a time limit, just like you would for a conference, like a 5-minute run through of the poster. So this is a really fun way to get students to apply to something that they may actually do in the future if they're going to go into research. Portfolios are really good for certain fields. So for example, education or teaching, where the student's actually going to show this in an interview and it'll help them get a job. You can also do written portfolios that will turn maybe into something bigger, like maybe a research paper, if you're having them do the portfolio almost like in pieces. But different fields value the portfolio differently, but it can be a really useful tool in your class. Case studies, sometimes this is the only way and the best way for application in clinical settings. So you can demonstrate that you really know as a student how to apply the concepts you're learning based off of how you approach a particular case study. Also, students tend to really like case studies because it's information about a person that's real, or you can make up the case studies, but it's more fun when you use real cases that obviously have that are completely anonymous or taken from papers. But students really get a lot out of the case studies and talking through those. Self-assessment's helpful for reflections and journals, self-critiques. The key is having a nice rubric that students will not just kind of free write and then not think about how they're tying that back into the concepts that they're learning. So being really clear on how to do a self-assessment and then having them compare a self-assessment, for example, in the beginning to the end of the course. Peer assessment is also really helpful, but you have to be really careful about peer assessment. So I would not make it grade dependent in terms of they're dependent on the grade from their peer, because students do sometimes they might give each other grades because they might have a history with each other, right? They might fail them not because the work was bad, but because they don't like them. It's a little risky if you're going to assign a grade to it, but really what you want to do is give them a very specific rubric. So typically what I do for peer assessment is I give them a rubric that does not have points. So they have to assess each other with what we're going to talk about this in a minute, a more holistic rubric, and they have to give them more structured feedback. So this can be very helpful with rubrics. Another thing that you have to think about is inter-rater reliability, and making sure that all the students understand how to use the rubric properly and that they're using it the same way. And then the final thing, coming back to group projects. So students typically hate group projects because they're worried that a group member might be slacking off. And so having something where the students are graded individually for the work that they do is helpful. So if a student, for example, doesn't do their part, that they don't impact the entire group's grade. So just kind of thinking about that sort of thing. Okay, the final thing that I am going to talk about is rubrics. And so we're going to talk about different types of rubrics. So a holistic rubric is one that has a rating scale that includes particular criteria, but it might use, for example, weak, satisfactory, and strong, right? So these are different kind of criterias that are broader. So an example of weak is if they're writing a paper, the thesis is unclear, the work isn't organized, there's lack of organization of ideas, there's grammatical errors. Satisfactory might be overall thesis is clear. Organization mostly supports the thesis. Strong might say the thesis statements located in the introduction, the writing style, organization offer ample evidence to support the overall thesis, to demonstrate that this is what you expect in terms of these kind of different levels. So the advantages of a holistic rubric is that the learner can demonstrate what they do know versus what they don't. And it can be used more consistently across raters. So, if you kind of train them how to use it, it's a little bit easier for peers to rate each other. Some of the disadvantages is unless you explicitly tell students to do this or do this, you don't typically have specific feedback for improvement. It's just kind of picking the different categories. It can be difficult to choose a score when you see different varying levels of work across the criteria that you've set. And you can't really weight the criteria with a holistic rubric. Whereas the analytic rubric is more of the traditional, what you would think of. It's using a rating scale to evaluate each criteria separately. So this is a much more specific kind of way to view that. And so what you're seeing is like the typical kind of grid form where you have, this pen is just not going to work today, where you have actual gridded out matrix. And so that's kind of what you're expecting in a typical analytic rate rubric. So the advantages of this, obviously, you can provide feedback that they can see as strengths or weaknesses. Each criterion can be weighted so that you can demonstrate, okay, I put less emphasis on formatting and more emphasis on organization, for example. Whereas the holistic one doesn't have a rating. It's not rated in that same way, weighted in that same way, I should say. There's ratings, but the analytic rubric is weighted. Some disadvantages, of course, is that it's really time consuming to create and to use an analytic rubric. And it's also hard to do in terms of consistently rating across raters. And so you have to be really, really explicit with that. Now, let's talk about the sort of steps in designing a rubric. So the first thing you want to do is define your criteria. So what knowledge and skills are required for this assignment or this assessment? So you're going to make a list, group them, label them, eliminate anything that isn't sort of vital or necessary. We're thinking like no more than 6 to 7 criteria, but I found that sweet spot tends to be about 5. And then you can review the learning objectives that you have for the course, make sure that everything's kind of lining up. You can use grading checklists that you might have, any peer response sheets that you might have, feedback that you've given on previous work, examples of student work that you've received in the past, especially if it's a really similar project or assignment. You can talk to other colleagues. There's a lot of resources online about kind of developing these criteria as well. Brainstorm, talk to your own students. And things that you need to ask yourself about your criteria. Can you observe and measure these? Are they important and essential? Can you distinguish them from each other? Are they distinct from other criteria? And then you want to then, of course, revise the criteria as needed. And especially as you continue using rubrics, you're going to want to make sure you tweak these to reflect the proper weighting. And you say, you know what, I don't really care about formatting as much anymore. I'm going to give that a lower rating, but I care more of the structure of the paper, for example. Number 2, you're going to design the rating scale. So most rating scales have about 3 to 5 levels or so. Again, the sweet spot tends to be about 3 to 4 levels. So you want to consider what are the possible levels of achievement, given what you have seen your students be able to demonstrate, given, what you've seen in the past. Are you going to use numbers? Are you going to use numbers or are you going to use descriptions for your labels? If you're going to use descriptions, which ones are going to be most appropriate? And how are you going to list the levels? So are you going to go from lowest to highest? So a 0, to 5, or are you going to, go 5 to 0? How are you going to level out these numbers? So, for example, you might say, well, why would you go this route? Well, if you're used to writing grants, then you'll know that the lower the score, the better. And so you might want to have a project that resembles a grant grant writing process. And so lower might actually be better than higher. And then finally, you're going to then write the descriptions of the rating scales, right? So you are then going to, for each rubric, you're going to have an expected performance at each level of the rubric. And so you want to think about your descriptions. You want to think about how measurable and observable each of the levels are. You want to use parallel language across the scale. So, you can tweak it to say, mostly there, somewhat there, not present at all. Or if it's like grammatical errors, there are no significant grammatical errors, things like that. And then you can indicate the degree to which the standards are met based off of these descriptions. And then finally, you're going to create that rubric, right? That's like sort of the final step after you've done all this. It sort of creates itself at this point. And then you want to test. So step 5 is test, right? Test this rubric out. Make sure that it is effective. Try it out on a sample of students' previous work. Test it out to make sure that this is measuring what you want to measure and that it's a good tool. I've found with teaching for many, many years, it's all often about trial and error, right? So just trying to figure out what works and in what setting. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know, and I look forward to our discussion on this.